Good day, this is Dr. Michael Chan, and you are watching video 3 in the course OT 2112, the Book of Jeremiah online. Again, welcome back, and the purpose of this video is to cover to raise some of the major themes and questions that we're going to encounter in the book of Jeremiah. So I'm going to name a theme and then provide a number of questions and related issues that we're going to cover. So that's the topic for this video. Theme 1 is divine judgment. And if there is any theme that unites the entire book of Jeremiah, it is this theme of divine judgment. It is right at the center of what the book of Jeremiah is about. And most of the texts that we are going to be reading this semester and interacting with will have something to do either with the anticipation of divine judgment, God's judgment specifically against Judah, or reflecting on what kind of future can Judah have in the wake of divine judgment. What happens after the disaster has occurred? What happens after there is a ground zero? What happens after all the dust settles? And so most of Jeremiah, most of what we're going to encounter in this book is going to deal with the anticipation of divine judgment or the reflection on what Judah's life before God can look like in light of divine judgment. Let me give you a quotation from William Holiday, a very well-known commentator on the book of Jeremiah. This is what he says, quote, "Jeremiah was convinced that his mission was to announce to his people God's judgment upon them for their disloyalty, a judgment manifested primarily through an invasion and defeat by the Babylonian army." Now there are some important historical details to highlight in that quotation, in particular about the facts about the Babylonians, and we'll actually deal with those issues at a later point. At this point, I just want to say that this really is seems to be Jeremiah's mission, is to announce this forthcoming judgment, which will come historically by the hand of the Babylonians. And a key issue that I'm going to bring up later in the semester, and we'll really be pushing throughout the semester, is the reason why was Judah judged? And for the book of Jeremiah, that answer is going to be deeply rooted in the theology associated with the book of Deuteronomy, and also with the book of Kings, and some of the books prior to that, Joshua, Judges, and 1st and 2nd Samuel. Some of this literature is often called Deuteronomic or Deuteronomistic because of its apparent close relationship to the book of Deuteronomy. And Jeremiah also has this close relationship. And so we're going to ask, what are the reasons for this judgment? What does Jeremiah see as the primary cause of this judgment? And what we'll find is that both Jeremiah and Deuteronomy place great value on keeping especially the first commandment, on worshiping and loving God alone, with no other, and there being no other gods beside or in addition to Yahweh. And so that is the whole matter of divine judgment. And so we'll want to ask questions: why is God judging Judah? How is God going to carry out that judgment historically? Given the legal connotation of the word judgment in our present culture, we're going to have to ask, does the book of Jeremiah use similar legal connotation or have similar legal ideas floating around this concept of judgment? Or are there other associations that judgment has in the book of Jeremiah that we'll need to explore in order to fill out this picture, or to fund our own imagination around the topic of divine judgment? And then when taking this question into the contemporary world, we need to ask how and whether we can talk about divine judgment today. Can we speak about God judging individuals or corporate groups? Can we speak about God judging them, and how can we think about identifying those acts of divine judgment. So all of these are questions that we're going to take up throughout the semester. The second theme is God. And God is of course a huge theme, and a theme that you could ask of almost any book in the Old Testament. What kind of God does the book of Jeremiah actually have? And this is a question that the author Terry Fretheim, in his commentary on Jeremiah, will take up in great detail. And in almost every page you'll see Fretheim reflecting on the question of God, how God is depicted in the book of Jeremiah, what sorts of metaphors are used to describe God and God's actions. And you'll see quite a bit of reflection on God in Fretheim's book, which is one of the main reasons why we use it, because he really puts these God questions at the front and center of the conversation. I think that's really, really important. And so we're going to have to ask questions like, how does God act in the book of Jeremiah? In other words, how does God get things done? What is God doing in the book of Jeremiah? The way that we say it in the common day, or in the current day, is, what is God up to? What kind of mission is God on? And we can ask the same questions of the book of Jeremiah. What is God up to in this book? What is God's mission according to these words in the book of Jeremiah? What is God doing in the world? What is God doing with Jeremiah? What is God doing with Judah? What is God doing with the nations? And we can then ask, how do these texts describing God's action help us identify what God is up to in the world today? The third theme I'm going to call the prophet and the prophetic vocation. Now, more than any other prophetic book in the Old Testament, the person of Jeremiah is right in the forefront, is put forward, and is in fact put on display. The life and even the inner life of Jeremiah becomes an extremely important part of the theology, of the theology of the book of Jeremiah. Many of us, for example, will be able to relate to the fact that Jeremiah's vocation and Jeremiah's relationship to God are both a source of incredible joy for Jeremiah, but also a source of great pain and distress. Both his relationship to God and his vocation in the world, the thing to which he's called, the thing to which God has called him to direct his energies, those are both a source of joy and frustration and also pain. Let me make a number of comments about Jeremiah's life as it's depicted in the book that I think are noteworthy at this point. First of all, Jeremiah's life is set at a time of national crisis. I've already mentioned this with regard to the Babylonians, and we will discuss that in greater detail. We'll discuss kind of the history of the book in the next few lectures. But it's enough to say now that Jeremiah is a book, and the character of Jeremiah is a character who is standing on the brink of disaster. And when one considers the entire book, he's also a prophet who speaks after, in the wake of disaster. Secondly, Jeremiah was rejected and even persecuted by people in his audience, and especially people in power. So Jeremiah knows great suffering. Jeremiah's call causes him suffering, and great opposition arises to him. Third, God's relationship to Jeremiah is depicted in honest and sometimes even combative ways. As with many of the Psalms, Jeremiah does not hesitate to say, "How long, God? How much longer will you delay? Or why are you doing this?" Jeremiah is a very honest book on that level. And Jeremiah, the texts the words that are placed into the mouth of Jeremiah are extremely honest, sometimes combative, and when we read them, we can sometimes feel even embarrassed by how honest Jeremiah is. And let me give you a quotation again from Holiday. This is what he says. Quote, "Alone among the prophets of the Old Testament, Jeremiah saw his relationship with God to be a problem to be grappled with, more than simply an obligation to be taken for granted." Think about that language. Jeremiah saw his relationship with God to be a problem that Jeremiah had to grapple with. Listen to Jeremiah's words. This will give you just a little taste of what I think Holiday is talking about. This is from Jeremiah 23, verse 9. Jeremiah says, "My heart is broken within me. All my bones tremble. I am like a drunken man, like a strong man overcome by wine, because of the Lord and his holy words." Think about these metaphors. For instance, the metaphor of the drunken man. He is describing himself as somebody who has somehow being oppressed to the point where he is overcome by wine, or overcome such that his body is not doing what he wants him to do. He is stumbling and trembling, like even a strong man who is overcome by wine. Jeremiah has been overcome with grief. His heart has been broken. Notice these uses of Jeremiah is of a passive. He is like someone who has been overcome, whose heart is broken. Jeremiah, on some level, sees himself as a victim, or as somebody who has been acted upon in negative ways. So as we navigate Jeremiah, what we're going to see, we're going to find all of this extremely honest speech. And like I said, when we come across this, this might feel like the family secret that needs to be hidden from guests and people who are sort of overlooking our shoulders. It sounds like the honest speeches of Job or the Lamentations in the Psalms, and we might want to hide these things away from skeptics or people who are skeptical of Christianity, or who think it is not worthwhile. But in fact, I think that these are the kinds of texts that we should put forward and say, Christianity is the kind of faith that can bring this kind of honesty to its God, that can interact with God in such a forthright and honest way, and that Christians should not be afraid of this kind of thing. And I think in particular of millennials and Gen Xers who might appreciate this kind of honesty, who might appreciate that within the biblical text there is this kind of straight-talking discourse with God. So these are actually texts that I think we should put forward. Theme number 4, I'll call history, theology, and ideology. And really the kinds of questions here are, what is the relationship between the theological messages that we find in the book of Jeremiah and the socio-historical setting in which those messages were written or spoken? Historians never tire of saying that events never happen in a vacuum, or texts are never written in a vacuum. And it's a bit cliche now, so let me put it differently. Theology, including the book of Jeremiah, is never above the fray. Right? It is never above the contentious fray of history, where arguments are happening and where economic realities are pressing themselves and on to people, and where political decisions have real and life-changing consequences. The book of Jeremiah is never above the fray of daily life and the fray of the politics and the realities of the day. And so this brings me to the point of ideology and social location. Since theology and biblical texts are never above the fray, we also need to probe those texts for their ideological commitments. Now, I know that in the modern English language, we often use and think of the word ideology negatively. So we might say of a politician who we don't like, we might say, well, she or he is just an ideologue, or somebody who is speaking out of ideology, and so that would be a negative use of ideology. Or within the work of Karl Marx, ideology also takes on a negative tone, and within Marx, ideology is sort of like the Wizard of Oz, right? The man who is hiding behind a curtain and a loud or a big voice attempting to intimidate people. This is how it's often thought of. It is ideology is sort of the curtain that weak people hide behind, or that allows the curtain, or the projection put forward that allows people to stay in power. And this is often how we think about ideology. I'm going to use it in a slightly different way to simply refer to truth claims that people make. So ideology refers to truth claims about the world, saying the world is this way or the world is that way. This is ideology, and it's neutral. All of us are ideological, right? All of us who make truth claims about the way things are, the way the world is, all the truth claims that we make, this is ideology. And that's not to dismiss it, it's simply to say that this is just a neutral way of talking about those truth claims. So since Jeremiah is not above the fray, but it's in the fray, it's deeply involved in the politics and the real life of its day, we want to ask the question, what kind of ideology does Jeremiah have? What social location does Jeremiah speak from? Who are Jeremiah's opponents and what is their ideology? What ideologies do we see in conflict with one another? Or supporting one another in the book of Jeremiah? And so we will sometimes examine the Jeremianic texts through the lens of what scholars call ideological criticism. We're just going to look for truth claims. How does Jeremiah see the world? How do his opponents see the world? And why are they in conflict with one another? Theme number 5, Jeremiah, trauma, and disaster. Now, I'm touching here on themes that you will mostly find in O'Connor's work. This is your second book, Jeremiah, Pain, and Promise. And so O'Connor is going to argue that, quote, Jeremiah is a book of resilience, a survival manual, a literary anthology, and a work of theological art, whose goal it is to help survivors of a traumatic event, in this case the exile, begin to reimagine the world in hopeful ways, but also in deeply honest ways. And so what O'Connor has done is drawn on a particular type of academic discourse, trauma theory, and is attempting to bring that in conversation and really interpret the book of Jeremiah through the lens of trauma theory. And I think there are many useful insights that she comes up with, and I say that because trauma and grief and traumatic events, disastrous events, often give rise or often become seedbeds of creativity, often become events that help to generate and spur people on to write literature. Let me just give you a couple of modern examples. In preparation for this class, I did a lot of looking into 9/11 and the literature that arose after that. And there are anthologies of poetry that were written in the wake of 9/11. And in fact, in New York itself, in the city, in and around Ground Zero, people in the wake of 9/11 began posting poetry publicly about the disaster and responding to the loss of loved ones in various ways. And so what we see in that is that this trauma, this disaster, 9/11 actually helped to generate literature, and was sort of an impetus, a creative impetus for people to reflect on the disaster and how they should live in light of the disaster, how they should relate to those who created this disaster. All of these things reflect this human impulse to create literature in light of suffering. And another earlier 20th century example would be the Holocaust or the Shoah. Of course, Hitler's systematic execution and killing of some 6 million Jews, and there has been just a flood of Jewish literature and that has arisen in light of the Shoah, in light of the Holocaust, and even today, drama, poetry, biography and autobiography, many different genres reflecting on this disastrous event. And so we want to understand Jeremiah too, as we want to think about Jeremiah as a response and as, in fact, an outgrowth of trauma and disaster. Next theme, true and false prophecy. Jeremiah, more than any other book in the Bible, deals with this theme of true and false prophecy. And most of these texts are related to Jeremiah's own conflict with other prophets who called him a liar, or who said that Jeremiah, you are wrong, or Jeremiah saying, no, you are wrong. And so there's this whole discourse of true and false prophecy that emerges within the book of Jeremiah that I think is incredibly relevant for today. Just think about the big church debates that have happened over the last decades, or of course the one that we are currently in the middle of deals with how the church should respond to people who are in same-sex relationships, or who are in favor of ordaining people who are in same-sex relationships or homosexuals, or even this, and of course this conversation is part of the broader cultural conversation of what sorts of legal rights gays and lesbians and other people in kind of non-traditional sexual relationships, what kinds of legal rights they should be given. And so at the heart of this whole issue is discernment. The church and the larger society attempting to determine what is best for society, or in our case as a church, what is best for us. How do we determine what is true or what is false, or in this case, what is going to be best for the church's future, what is going to be true to scriptural witness, what is going to be true to our tradition. And it's an incredibly complex conversation, but it can be helpfully viewed as a process of discernment, of deciding between what is true and what is false, what is right and what is wrong. And so I think that this, the whole question of true and false prophecy is just one branch of the larger tree of discernment. And the book of Jeremiah will give us the opportunity to reflect on discernment and true and false prophecy as a theological category. And I think this is going to be profoundly helpful. And it's not that we will necessarily come out of this course with a set of criteria that say, this is how you identify a false prophet, this is how you identify a true prophet. We may not come out with that. We may simply come out recognizing that this is a difficult problem, it's very complex, and that we may not be able to put all of our situations kind of through the computer and get an answer on the other end. It most certainly will not be that simple, but we will gain, I think, a greater appreciation for how difficult and how challenging and complex the task of discerning true and false prophecy is. And of course, we'll need to ask the question: how do we discern true? How do we identify true and false prophets today? And I think this is not just a question for ancient Israel. This is also a question for us. Okay, last theme that I want to touch on is the prophet Jeremiah. I'll call this the prophet Jeremiah and the book called Jeremiah. And what I'm doing here is I'm playing a bit with language, and I'm borrowing from a book that was written by a very prominent scholar of the book of Isaiah. He teaches at Oxford University, Hugh Williamson, H.G.M. Williamson, and he wrote a book called The Book Called Isaiah. His book is titled The Book Called Isaiah. And what he's trying to get at is, when we say the book of Isaiah, it's a little bit ambiguous, and we might think, well, does that mean that the book was authored by Isaiah? Or is it simply about Isaiah? What does it mean to say the book of Isaiah? And so, the same is true with the book of Jeremiah. What we're going to learn is that the historical person of Jeremiah is not responsible for all of the literature that falls within the book of Jeremiah itself. That is to say, the book of Jeremiah has grown beyond the historical person and the writings that may be attributed to him, and has become something that is larger than the book of Jeremiah. And so we're going to actually see that process at work within the book itself, where we see the book expanding and growing. And one analogy, a way you can think about how the book of Jeremiah developed, is as a snowball. A number of scholars in the present day prefer to think about how we got the book of Jeremiah as a rolling corpus. And the analogy that I like to use is that of a snowball rolling down a hill. think about when you roll a snowball down the hill. It usually, it begins maybe at this size, but by the time it gets down to the bottom of the hill, its size for sure, and often its shape will have changed. And this is what happened with the book of Jeremiah. Whatever the original form, this is to say the original form of the book of Jeremiah, whether that was a collection of Jeremiah's sermons and speeches, or some biographical elements, we're not always certain what the original form of Jeremiah looked like. But whatever that was, what we have is very different from it, and it has grown and been curated and edited over many years, and by people that we'll refer to as scribes, and people who have kept the book of Jeremiah going and updated and edited it and preserved. And so we'll talk about the historical person of Jeremiah, but we will also talk about the book of Jeremiah as something that outlived and that even went beyond the person and the original work of Jeremiah. So those are the themes that I want to touch on today. These aren't the only themes that we're going to encounter in Jeremiah, and in fact, in this first week, you'll have the opportunity to raise some of your own questions and reflect a bit on what you want to learn about the book of Jeremiah, some of the themes that you want to touch on or that you're familiar with, and I really look forward to reading what you have to say about that. Thank you for watching this video, and as always, if you have questions about the course or about a certain element that was mentioned in the videos, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.